So for my final reflection for this class, I wanted to create this video. I'm someone who struggles with presentation, and I thought it would be great to get more practice and to get a little bit more experience in this type of format. So I'm going to touch on some of the key things I have learned and kind of reflect on a little bit of my journey through this class. So right off the bat, there were two very broad, basic things that I immediately started to take away. They may seem a little silly, but they're very important to me. The first thing was that I quickly learned that there are no right answers. I wrongly came into this class and assumed that I was going to walk away with more concrete, answers to some of the questions that had come up both like personally for me and also in my class. I also learned that I still don't know anything. I may have gained a lot of great information when reading through, all the material, talking with students, learning from classes, but as someone who has not practiced in this field outside of a internship, I don't really have the experience to really have any sort of context or really know a huge amount. So kind of thinking through those just to start out with. So one of the first things I wanted to touch on that I constantly thought about throughout this class was the ethical principles of social work and librarianship. As I've mentioned several times, I come from a background of social work, and I hold that very close to my heart. I have found that a lot of my personal values align with social work, and I've constantly thought throughout this class how the Code of Ethics through the National Association of Social Workers, how that compares to the ALA Code of Ethics that we refer back to. So just to start out with, the Code of Ethics for NASW is very extensive. They have a list of 6 ethical principles that are really great. The first is service, and that is something that we talk about in librarianship as well. Dignity and worth of the person is also something big that I find that comes up in librarianship. We want to respect our patrons, provide best service, and make sure that they have equitable access. Another big one that I think is transferable is competence. We are in some ways problematically known as gatekeepers to information and help other people find the information they need. So competence is something that's really high up for us. I also think social justice is key for social work. I wish that librarianship focused a little more on social justice, but I think that's changing a little bit. Another great thing about the NASW Code of Ethics is all of these ethical standards. There's a lot of them. I'm not going to go through them, but I think these are really great to look at and to think through when knowing that many ethical dilemmas that come up in social work can be addressed through these ethical standards, when often that's not the case in librarianship. And I think that's a big reason why this class exists. So the ethical standards includes responsibility to clients, there's responsibility to colleagues, under clients, privacy and confidentiality is a big one, which we talk about a lot in librarianship. Responsibility to colleagues, responsibilities on practice settings, I think that's key. As professionals, responsibilities to the social work profession itself, which I think is great, and ethical responsibilities to the broader society. So these are all really great. It's very extensive. There's a lot of information about it. So I always think through this because as a social worker, I had a lot of great examples for how to address ethical dilemmas. When thinking through the ALA Code of Ethics, this is the document. This is from the ALA website. There are this many 8 principles that are listed. The first is service, which is what is listed first for social work as well. And then, of course, principles of intellectual freedom, privacy and confidentiality, which is also mentioned by social work, and I think that is key often for a lot of service-oriented professions. Intellectual property rights, and then treating coworkers and other colleagues with fairness, respect, and good faith. That was a whole extensive section in an ASW Code of Ethics. So this is just something I thought through. The discrepancy here, the difference, how maybe some of the reasons why some of these ethical dilemmas are so difficult for librarians is because we don't have a clear code of ethics that lays out a lot of the same things as social work. I also really thought about this concept of the right to know. I found this very interesting when we were talking about all the rights, freedoms that we have and how those relate to libraries, particularly in this O'Brien article. I really liked how they laid out how Wiggins defined the public's right to know with these 5 key components. The right to get information, the right to print without prior restraint, the right to print without fear, the right of access to facilities, the right to distribute information. And I thought a lot of those were key to what I have learned both in my internship and during my classes, particularly the right of access to facilities and material essential to communication. I think that's a big part of what librarians do and what libraries do. They provide physical spaces for people to come in and access what they need. I also just enjoyed this section because of this sentence, the public's right to know engenders political controversy. I just really enjoy that. I'm a fan of political controversy, and I like that concept, and I enjoyed learning about that. Another big thing that I thought about a lot throughout this class, and I've discovered this is a big thing in other classes, as well as sometimes in the work I was doing as a graduate intern. A lot of times I found that many librarians lean on impartiality and claim that that is the most ethical way to be a librarian, when I have found that to be impartial is often to be unethical. And this can come up in several ways. First off, this Isaacson article pointed out that public service librarians, which this is also transferable to academic librarians or other special librarians as well, are never completely neutral or objective information providers. It's not really possible to be neutral or objective with anything, and maintaining impartial behavior often makes someone complicit with systems of oppression. I think about this a lot as a person. I am queer, I'm non-binary, I am also disabled, and all of these are very visible things. My queerness is very visible. I can't separate my queerness from my, identity as a librarian. They are interconnected, as well as my disability. That'll show up in various ways as a librarian. And I also think it is unethical to separate these and try to ignore my identity, because I think that provides a disservice to other queer, non-binary, or trans disabled people who may be patrons and may need someone to fight for access, or even other colleagues who need support. So I've been thinking a lot about impartiality, and this is something we've talked about in class. But that's one of the biggest things that's come up for me, is how do I, as a queer, non-binary, disabled person, show up as a librarian, provide the best services, fight for equitable access, fight for policies that make libraries accessible to everyone, people of all different identities. So that's definitely something I thought through a lot through this class. I also enjoyed thinking through ethical constructs. This was a little challenging for me in some ways because I'm not sure why, but this was a little harder for me to grasp. Not because the material that was provided was in any way unclear, just as a person, it was a little harder for me to grasp this and wrap my head around it. But I started thinking through this, particularly through the casuist ethical approach. I found that that was often similar to some things that would happen in social work, which I often supported. So this establishment of weighted good, or process of reasoning that seeks to resolve moral problems by extracting or extending theoretical rules from a particular case and reapplying those rules to new instances, was interesting to think through. And I constantly found myself thinking about how case studies that we brought up in class, particularly with the Neonomicon, how this ethical approach could be applied. And all of this is to say, it all boils down to how we make decisions. I think I thought about my previous role as a social worker, the values that I carried through that, how those have transferred into values that I hold now as a librarian. Also, the concept of remaining impartial being problematic, and how I show up as a queer, non-binary, disabled person in a workplace, how I show up as a librarian, as a person, and how that influences my decisions. And I think a big part of that has come up with embracing the gray in all of these ethical decisions. In a lot of class discussions we've discussed pornography, privacy, neonomicon, and it's been hard in a lot of different ways. I expected to come in and have answers to a lot of these, and I think I've just come out of this class knowing that I'm not really going to have answers, particularly with things that are very complex, like pornography and privacy, as I often think these through a personal lens, and I expect others to kind of take their experiences into consideration as well. But I think embracing the gray is the point, and I think there is no one right answer, and to assume so is unethical and unmoral. We need to leave room for people to have different opinions. We need to think through these things, and we need to make sure that we are providing the best services to our community by really thinking through. So, in conclusion, on top of those two things that I said in the beginning about me not knowing anything and there's no right answer, which I still hold are very important parts of this class, I've also learned that library ethics are complex, dynamic, and fluid. Also, like I mentioned, embracing the gray is key, and I recognize that my identity plays a huge part in this. And lastly, while I didn't necessarily gain concrete answers, I learned important language and terms. I learned about great authors, great resources, people to talk to, and also I've saved course material that I can use and reflect on if and when an ethical dilemma comes up. So there was a lot. It was really hard to take in all this in 5 weeks, and I'm not sure if I feel like I've successfully done that to some extent, but that's just part of the learning process. I have the resources I need, I can refer back to them, and I can work towards making ethical decisions that are appropriate and are just good for my community.